informed our choices in life. Our mother is well known for her fearlessness during the struggles against apartheid, when she engaged in struggle through direct activism, as well as through her academic teaching and writing. She is known also for continuing her fearless struggle against oppression and for freedom and dignity beyond 1994, when she worked alongside communities in setting up the Concerned Citizens Group and the Durban Social Forum to resist evictions and disconnections of water and electricity supplies. She engaged in these struggles even though this meant confronting and challenging the ANC, an organization she had supported and been a part of for most of her life. She expressed her criticism of the ANC openly and fearlessly, even though this meant taking on her friends and comrades. In the year 2000, she said, "We do not have a leadership committed to fighting poverty. We have a corrupt leadership. That is our tragedy. If resources are reserved for only the wealthy, if government shows a commitment only to the middle class, then all I can say is cry the beloved country and cry and cry and cry. I have always stood for the poor and the rights of the poor. And though I and all my friends have been in the ANC for over 60 years, if I have to stand against the organization to address the needs of the vast majority of South African citizens, then I will unhappily do so." The situation in the present time, 22 years since my mother spoke these words, is even worse. The extent of corruption that has been uncovered, yet with little accountability, the extent of state failures and dysfunction, all of this would perhaps have been impossible for her to imagine. The plight of the majority of South Africans has worsened. We are a country where the majority lack access to work, where children die of starvation, and where decent education and healthcare are available only to the rich. We are a country in crisis in so many ways, as the July 2021 events in Durban so graphically highlighted. I am often asked, what would my mother and people of her generation who spent their lives in struggle think and say of the situation we are in today? Alan van Zedem, a close friend and colleague of my mother's, noted at the time of the July crisis, "As this crisis unfolds in Durban, my thought has been that if your mum was around, we would be out in the orange VW, making our way through hostile mobs of folk who might or might not kill us, and palls of smoke documenting the unfolding events." I recall my mother doing just that at the time of the 1985 crisis in Inanda, when she also went to the Gandhi settlement to save what she could of the books and artifacts, the fires burning around her. I end with words from my mother that are apt for our present time. My mother said, "We have to be in the process of perpetual revolution in order to progress and guarantee the rights of people. There can be no peacetime so long as there is poverty and hunger, and so long as basic human rights are trodden. The cause of rampant crime in our country is inequality. We are the second most unequal country in the world. More than half the population lives in poverty. Can we call this living in peace? The definition of peace is equity, harmony, not starvation. I believe we need to strengthen the numerous community-based organizations in our country and increase the voices of civil society. Clearly, the struggle for freedom is not over.
Spoken like a true daughter of Mama Fatima. Spoken like a true daughter of Mama Fatima, absolutely. Wathinta abafazi, wathinta imbokodo, uzokufa. Ubobhasopa, wathinta abafazi, wathinta imbokodo, uzokufa. Ubobhasopa, wathinta abafazi, wathinta imbokodo, uzokufa. Ubobhasopa. They sang that song on the day they went to Pretoria in 1956. That song was remembered and sung over and over again so that we would not forget. And we often hear a person is never truly forgotten until we choose to forget them. And we will never forget the likes of the powerful, amazing Professor Fatima Meer. Our keynote speaker, I'd like to introduce her. Professor Shireen Hassim is Canada 150 Research Chair in Gender and African Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, and visiting professor, Visa, Wits University. She has written and edited several books, including No Shortcuts to Power, Women and Policy Making in Africa, Women's Organizations and Democracy, Contesting Authority and Go Home or Die Here, Violence, Xenophobia, and the Politics of Difference in South Africa. Her interests lie in feminist theory and politics, collective action and histories of mobilization of women in Africa, and social policies and gender. Her most recent book was an archival recuperation of the work of the South African sociologist, Professor Fatima Meer. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Shireen Hassim.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mhlope. Let me begin by saying that I feel very honored to be invited to speak at this very first lecture in the new Fatima Meer lecture series. And I would like to thank the organizers, the university, but especially Drs. Lubna Nadvi and Mariam Sidat Khan, who I know have been tirelessly working towards this lecture for some time now. I'm also honored to be speaking at my alma mater and to have a response from one of the people who inspired my own academic career, Uma Dupelia Mistry. Not only was she a role model as a lecturer at the University of Durban-Westville, the university to which all Indians were forced to attend, but she was also she was at the time one of the few Indian women in academia when I was a student. And I think it's worth shouting out here also to Professors Sabita Jiptu and Devi Bhagwan, who taught at the University of Durban-Westville. But Uma Dupelia Mestry's own work on Indian South Africans has really shaped my and other people's scholarship as well. Dr. Nadvi has commented that we are convening on a day when there is a national general strike, protesting about issues that affect us all, bread and butter issues, as we would have called it. And that, as she points out, would certainly be something Professor Meer would have drawn our attention to were she still with us today. The escalating standard of living, load shedding, petrol prices, rising interest rates, and record unemployment. None of us can deny that we are living, as Shireen Meer said, in the midst of an ever worsening crisis, and that life for many of us has become unbearable. I would like to acknowledge the strike and the importance of the attempt to continue to speak powerfully and collectively to the people running our country. Professor Meer was an inspiration to me when I was a student at the University of Durban-Westville and later at the University of Natal. And I was really delighted to curate her work for the HSRC volume, Voices of Liberation. In doing that work, I had the privilege of reading through her oeuvre of published work. Let me tell you, it's a huge body of work. Her speeches, through myriad interviews with her in South Africa and beyond. Doing that work confirmed for me that Professor Meer was a leading scholar in 20th century South Africa, and surely one of the University of KwaZulu-Natal's most illustrious alumni. Recognizing her through the establishment of this lecture is not only timely, but it corrects a historical wrong. And really, I want to begin especially with that historical wrong. Fatima Meer joined the University of Natal non-European section as an undergraduate student in 1948-1949. Although, as Shamim has said, and Lubna has said, she was already an activist by then, coming as she did from the very prominent political Meer family. She was not allowed to join the student organization NUSAS, nor was she or any other non-European so-called student allowed to wear the university blazer or any other official insignia of the university. Sitting in classrooms was racially segregated. Where they sat was defined by race. When she graduated in 1950 with a BA in sociology and psychology, she began an honors degree in sociology in 1951, in which there was a class of only 3 students, 2 Indian and 1 white. Only the white student passed, a situation that made Meer suspicious of the practices of grading. After considerable struggle, she was allowed to resit the examinations a year later, and she passed with splendid results. In 1957, under the mentorship of Leo Cooper, who was working very actively to de-racialize the academy, Fatima Meer joined the sociology department as a lecturer. But even then, when Leo Cooper left for a position in California, the loss of her mentor was very directly felt. Her salary was cut. For decades, she was the only Black woman lecturer on the faculty of the University of Natal. Her outspoken activism drew the ire of the political authorities. We're familiar with the bannings, but I want to point to the complicity of the university itself in the punitive response to her scholar activism. In 1968, the administrator of Natal instructed the university to remove Fatima Meer from teaching nurses and medical students in their first year. These were, at the time, the largest classes in her workload. And needless to point out, of course, those classes put her deeply into the community of activists in the medical section, medical school that were led by Steve Biko. In response to the administrator of Natal's direction, the university's principal, Professor Owen Horwood, duly instructed the head of the sociology department to comply with this demand. And I think to the shame of the department and the university, he duly did so, despite Fatima Meer seeking to challenge that. So much for the much vaunted liberal credentials of the University of Natal and its self-portrayal as an opponent of the apartheid state. To my knowledge, no formal apology was ever issued by the university. I may have missed it in my research. If so, I apologize, but if not, will the university ever address those parts of its history? I want to turn now to the theme that I have been asked to address, the role of the scholar activist in contemporary South Africa. As this is an inaugural lecture in the series named after Professor Meer, I want to use her life and her work to think through what we might learn. Let me first define the term scholar activist as being that particular category of academic that uses their work to address the key questions of the day, and who brings their research into conversation with communities, both by asking the questions that matter to communities, as well as providing empirically sound information and data that would shape the responses of those communities to their issues. This kind of multi-part definition uses criteria that we might argue go beyond the task of simply being a public intellectual. A public intellectual, I would say, is one who makes academic knowledge accessible to a general public and offers commentary or critique on social and economic and political issues. They do and must make a powerful impact, but they don't necessarily work with and in their local communities as scholar activists do. The scholar activist, I think, is a slightly different breed of academic. And I want to draw on the ideas of the American sociologist Eric Olin Wright, who outlines 4 tasks that the scholar activist must perform, each of which I think fits with the ways in which Professor Fatima Meer approached her work. First, he says, a scholar activist is motivated by an ethical approach. This is someone who is guided by moral values. And these are not just any values, but the values of freedom and democracy, of community and solidarity. Fatima Meer was driven by this motivation to develop a sociology for a common society, by a rage against injustice, and specifically the apartheid and colonial injustice of defining certain groups of people as outside of the common community, as people whose lives were of no value, whose lives did not matter to academic scholarship. She was driven by a profound belief in the value and capacity of research to rationally convince the powerful of the consequences of their choices. She was, first and foremost, a humanist who explored ideas of freedom, of equality, of sociability, and of progress. You know, I think it's worth noting that we also have scholar activists, particularly at the moment, who are guided by other kinds of values, by traditionalist chauvinists, by religious chauvinists who oppose human rights for women and queer people, and who seek to embed their narrow views on the whole of society. We see this happening all over the world. The kind of academic research and activism that is driven not in a way to build an inclusive and just society, but to build a racially or religiously exclusive society and to impose values on people. Those seem to me also the kind of scholar activists we do not want to celebrate. The second task of the scholar activist, according to Eric Olin Wright, is to diagnose the world as it is, in ways that are rigorous and factual. The moral questions, in other words, may guide us to asking, the concerns may help us to ask what the right questions are, but they're not enough to describe the world as it is. For that, we need the array of tools that we get from our professional work as well-trained, dedicated, careful scholars able to deal with the kinds of complexities of the real world. And the second task really draws our attention to the specific responsibilities we have to our professions, not only to our communities. Scholar activists must remain committed to academic and scholarly rigor, even when that is uncomfortable. They must remain, in other words, non-ideological, in the sense they must not twist the facts to suit immediate and convenient political ends. They must cultivate healthy skepticism and avoid simplifying complexities for the sake of pleasing those who hold power. And those who hold power may be government, but equally they may be the dominant forces in social movements. We must, as scholar activists, be prepared to speak to both of these groups Eric Olin writes, third and fourth tasks for the scholar activist are to offer theories of alternatives and theories of transformation. In other words, to show us how we might get from here to there. I'll pick up on those two themes a little later when I talk about the ways in which the vision of a non-racial society guided Fatima Meer's research and how and the kind of work she did to help us to think about how we might forge conversations across divides. Professor Meer spent her academic life trying to understand the life experience of subaltern groups, producing research that provided us for the long term with an alternative archive of race. She was concerned to bring class to life, as it were, to explore the life worlds of people living in a racist system. She sought to uncover the historical patterns and structural forces that operated on individuals located at the bottom of the social, political, and economic hierarchies, and to understand how those life experiences might account for or explain their views and actions. She had empathy for her research subjects, and she sought to understand their motivations and actions in the totality of these life experiences. You've heard how her work was steeped in her community activism, not just in the more obvious sense that she was part of the movement against apartheid, but also in a kind of more localized version of community activism. Now, it was not actually Fatima Meer's practice to make a distinction between community activism and political activism. But I do think there are some interesting distinctions between these two spheres, and that movement between community and politics, as in movements and parties, actually enhanced her scholarship on the one hand, and on the other hand, gave her scholarship credibility among marginalized communities. She worked with the community in Tin Town, for example, after two massive floodings. She founded the Natal Education Trust, which built schools in African townships. She established the Thembelihle Tutorial College in 1979. She set up a craft center at the Gandhi settlement in 1982. She set up Phambili High School in 1982 as well. All of these activities shaped her thinking, shaped her activist interventions, and shaped the way in which she understood her tasks as a researcher and understood how research might help the communities she worked with. These were all processes of mutual constitution. So let me one specific example to explain what I'm trying to say here. In the early 1970s, she established a self-help project in the Ngutu district. Fine, a community project, but that wasn't all. She also commissioned Liz Clark and Jane Ngombese to undertake a study of the area, unique for its time piece of work that captured the gendered nature of rural poverty in the KwaZulu-Natal. Nearly a decade later, when she and Winnie Mandela and others formed the Black Women's Federation, Ngutu was identified as an area needing support. In other words, you can see how these concerns were not just picked up and dropped, but became part of a larger project of work. She did not forget the people that she had worked with, nor was her form of community activism merely a short-term based charity activity. Fatima Meer was working at a time when the questions that she was raising were not considered worthwhile in academia. And it's a mark of her independence that she not only insisted on pursuing those research interests, but But when she came up against blockages in the academy, she created her own institutions to advance this research. So in this respect, one might say she was working at decolonizing the academy half a century ago. She became cognizant of the ways in which the gatekeepers within academic disciplines defined what was worthy of study very early on. She had intended to work on a book that later became the Portrait of Indian South Africans for her PhD. That was her initial idea, was that she would do it as a PhD, that she would build on the very excellent research she had done for Hilda Cooper, who produced her own book on Indians in Durban. Hilda Cooper, in fact, who was a mentor of Fatima Meer, she herself thought that Fatima Meer could use that work for her PhD. But when she proposed this idea to her supervisor, Hansi Pollack, she was told that's an insufficiently academic topic. Even getting a publisher to put out the book Portrait of Indian South Africans, the Portrait of Indians, proved almost impossible because she was at the time a banned person. So in the end, she had to publish that book herself. And yet it remains 50 years later, in my view, and I'm happy to debate this with anyone who disagrees, it's one of the most wide-ranging and sociologically fascinating studies of Indian people. It decisively upends this perception that continues to be held in the popular imagination that all Indians are well-off shopkeepers. This study and the other research work done by Fatima Meer led her to think about issues of class, race, and identity in ways that practically no one was doing at the time and that few still do today. Perhaps it was this very direct experience of rejection and indifference in the academy and a rejection and indifference to the kinds of issues of subaltern groups that she thought were important that made Meer think of setting up such entities as the Institute for Black Research, which eventually was housed at the University of Natal, but ran on its own terms very much. This institute, in my view, has been unfated, unfortunately unfated, despite the fact that its contributions to changing not only the approaches to research, but also to who conducts research was path-breaking. She trained a generation of Black researchers in the Institute for Black Research, many of whom went on to write their own books and become very important researchers themselves. At that time, in the 70s, and 80s, what the Institute was doing really was an exceptional task, one which I think today we can recognize more clearly because there's a conversation that is happening in the academic sphere about decolonizing research, and that conversation, I think, also kind of assumes that the project only started with this generation of scholars, when in fact it started a very long time ago, and we need to reclaim institutions like the IBR as the forerunners of the work that is happening today. In the IBR research, researchers didn't restrict themselves simply to critique. They stepped out of the academy and into communities and used their deep insider knowledge often to offer more complex understandings of working class lives, of working class idioms of expression, and to capture the aspirations of working class communities. The methodology may at times have been a little sloppy. The writing and editing may have been a little messy given the conditions under which they were working, but the insights are shining gems all too rare in the social sciences. The IBR's work centered on thinking about underclasses, and it's really important to point out that for much of Fatima Meer's life, in economic and social terms, those underclasses were Indian as well as African people in Natal. So she described in her work, I recommend you all read Portrait of Indians. She describes in this book the world of poverty in minute detail, its smells, its spaces, its dips and its peaks. But she also showed how, despite these constrictions, there was beauty and hope and spirituality and looking forward, and how the cultural forms that came to define that world did not mean that the people living in these areas, drawing on a range of cultures that were Indian, didn't mean that they were not South African. Meer's contribution to theorizing race is as important as this ethnographic work. She herself lived through what we would academically call multiple racial regimes, and in part she documented them. Mostly she refused the racial regimes she was growing up in. In her work we see how race was made over time in a process that American historians Karen and Barbara Fields called racecraft, right? She was aware that the idea of the Indian was literally an idea made in the course of Fatima Meer's lifetime across the world. The beginning of her life, at the beginning of the 20th century, actually this category that everybody takes for granted, Indian, even in the whole of empire, wasn't properly defined. It's in the course of empire that it comes to be defined, both, by the way, in India and in the diaspora. She herself in South Africa came to call herself Black, a term that was defined not in opposition to white and not defined by phenotypical attributes. There was a political category standing in opposition to state-made categories. It was a form of resistance to the sacred notion of race and the classificatory blueprints that apartheid gave us. She developed this concept in the milieu of the Black consciousness movement that was such an important part of Durban politics in the 70s and 80s, and with its thriving theoretical debates among the people who were included in Meer's circle, for example, was Steve Biko, Barney Patiana, Rick Turner, Strini Moodley, Sam Moodley, Sats Cooper, a range of thinkers forging radical new ideas through poetry, through art and theater. By placing herself within the Black consciousness tradition, what she was doing was disabling the state's racial categories. In curating her writing, I wanted really to draw this attention to this aspect of her work and to place Indian people inside the archives of Black consciousness. She was astute about how class cut across and alleviated, but did not ultimately escape the differences of race. Similarly with gender, right? She was among the very first to attempt to theorize gender within the Black consciousness tradition. For example, she wrote a play on Kratoa, presented a paper on the role of women at the landmark Hammanskraal conference. And by the early 1990s, she was drawing attention to the neglected field of women and work, in which she was making connections between women's unpaid domestic responsibilities and paid labor. Recent events in KwaZulu-Natal, which Meer has also drawn our attention to, and particularly the tensions between Indian and African residents in around Phoenix, make Meer's work immediately useful for analysis. The iconic event of 1949, in which African residents of Cato Manor and Melville attacked their Indian neighbors, was formative in Fatima Meer's life. She joined the Natal Indian Congress's efforts to calm the fears of Indian people. She was central to setting up refugee camps for those displaced by the violence. And in 1985, again, when Indian and African residents in Inanda, the location of the Gandhi settlement that Fatima Meer alluded to, when they clashed, she was again at the forefront of helping people to craft a democratic response. Her position both in 1949 and 1985 was very clear, that the instrumentalization of race for political purposes could be nothing other than the fulfillment of the logic of apartheid. She appealed to people in Natal to read the violence as the deliberate work of the apartheid state, as provocative acts by political parties, rather than being innate and inevitable hostilities between Indian and African people who could, to quote the apartheid logic, could never live together. She directed research at the time to uncover how heightened economic insecurity bred resentments and fear and drove people to rash out against their nearest targets. In Chatsworth in the late 1990s, she again rushed to the defense of poor communities and launched passionate arguments against parochial and racially enclaved politics. We saw in July 2021 how the old bogey of 1949 was resurrected by some African people to point a threatening finger at Indians, and by some Indians to imply that they would never be safe in Africa. Fatima Meer's response would have been sharp and clear, and her research into the ragged lives at the margins of the South African democratic so-called miracle would have been used to great effect in public debates. For Fatima Meer, while racism needed to be addressed, there were no certainties of race. Rather, the acts of categorization and balkanization are acts that are used to generate anxiety. And that did not stop in 1994. I would hope that returning to Meer's thinking, some of which is captured in this edited volume and in the archive that is being built, that returning to that thinking would offer future generations of scholars and activists a different conceptual roadmap to navigating racial capitalism and to reinvigorating the radical aspects of the project of non-racialism. Because what is certain is that her scholarship helps us to imagine and to recognize that Indian South Africans have a place, a stake in the country that is clear, that this is not an in-between space. It's not a space in which Indians are less than, or not enough, or not Black enough, or not white enough, or not fully South African, but that Indians are decisively here in South Africa and part of the complexity and diversity of the history and the present that is South Africa. Let me turn now slightly to a different question that comes out of the work that I've done on the life and contribution of Professor Meer. I've asked myself, what does it mean thinking about this lecture? What does it mean to honor a person? And it seems to me inadequate to render the contributions of the generations before us visible without also addressing what the meaning of that life is. We must, of course, provide the context for her life and work, but we must also think about what ethical responsibilities are placed on us to continue the good example of those who have gone before us, to question whether we are strengthening the foundations of that we have been given for generations to come. That is what genuine memorialization is. It's not simply an empty celebration once a year, but something more substantial and long-lasting. We are fortunate that the country Professor Meer and her comrades built allows us some freedom of speech. We are fortunate, of course, but we are not yet a proper democracy, nor does, as Professor Ojong said, nor does everybody have the freedom to choose their politics. Yet, as the assassinations of comrades in Durban most recently Abahlali's Linda Kuhle-Mnguni so distressingly show. What is our responsibility then as privileged citizens and as scholar activists in the here and now? Now, it seems to me that the conditions under which we work at universities are still incredibly hostile, possibly even more hostile to the kind of scholar activism that Fatima Meer represented. First, let's look at the idea of the university itself as a public institution. Are universities really dedicated to the public good, even knowing how hard that is to define? Is the notion of public good really evaporated? If there is such a thing as a public good, which we can begin to define, what kind of research might advance our understanding of the challenges of building an equal society? Sadly, such work, especially in the humanities and the social sciences, is increasingly underfunded. University managements are held hostage to a funding allocation mechanism that is deeply antithetical to the idea of universities serving this general good. And by saying held hostage, I think we also should note the extent to which many university managements actually collude with and advance that projects. As academics today, our lives are governed by entirely different metrics, outputs and throughputs and various forms of subsidy generation, the drive to raise research grants. These are far more important than the ideas in themselves. The message that we get in academia today is publish as much as you can regardless, so that individual researchers can get subsidy funds, so that they can be ranked in the problematic NRF ranking system, and the universities themselves can jockey for a place in this absolutely iniquitous ranking game. As academics, we are governed by this subsidy machine that dramatically undervalues local scholarship, pushes us into publishing into international and global journals, most of which do not actually care about the lives of the people we write about. Research institutes are now required to fund themselves. Usually such funds come from global funders rather than from our own government and university budgets. Superb niche journals that are rigorous and invaluable in developing our own archives. For example, the Journal of Natal and KwaZulu History that used to be based at the University of Natal, KwaZulu-Natal, have had their status removed and have to shut down. I'm as committed to quality and peer review as any serious scholar. Let me underline that. I'm not arguing for poor quality or sloppy research, but I am asking whether we are any longer able to conduct research that speaks to non-academic publics. It's the first point I want to make about the conditions for scholar activism today, and I would say they are highly constricted. Secondly, what are the conditions under which we are educating the next generation of scholars and public leaders? The classroom itself has become a factory. Class sizes are ever larger. The supports that are provided for students are less and less available. In these large classes, in which we have students who have highly unequal access to the resources needed to study, we barely can know the names of our students, let alone understand and respond to their individual needs. Imagine publishing of the kind that Fatima Meer promoted. It's unimaginable in the academy today. True scholar activist is someone like her who, as I suggested earlier, works with communities or publics, that produces research that is meaningful to groups that are relatively powerless to place their issues on the agendas of the powerful. I say, as an academic working both in the South African Academy and in the Canadian Academy, it is really hard to make the time to do that. We are working under conditions of complete exhaustion, and in general, we are working against, we are having to do any of the work that matter to us outside of what is valued by our university managements. I hope, in conclusion, that we will take forward the example of engaged and transformative scholarship that we are offered by Professor Fatima Meer in very deliberate and practical ways, and not merely in rhetoric. More than ever, we need historically accurate and fact-based scholarship to ensure that we move towards a genuine and inclusive democracy. Thank you, Dr. Mhlope.
Siyabonga, 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 siyabonga kakhulu. Thank you so much. I wish more young people that I know were listening to you today. And when we think of what you have shared with us, we think, did she ever go to sleep? Maybe she grew up in a family like in my mother's army, where you don't have time, you just have to go because it's so important to do what you have to do, and you only have one life to live. Thank you so much. I'd like to now introduce our respondent. This is the one and only Professor Uma Dopelia Maestri. She is Emeritus Professor, Department of History, University of the Western Cape. She is known for her work on India, South Africa, connected histories, and is the author with Malherbe C, Not Slave, Not Free, Indentured Labor, Pietermaritzburg, Shutter and Shooter in 1992. From Cane Fields to Freedom, a chronicle of Indian South African life, Cape Town Kwela Books, year 2000. She was the editor of Sita Memoirs of Sita Gandhi, Durban Local History Museums and South African History Online, year 2003. Gandhi's Prisoner, the life of Gandhi's son, Manilal, Cape Town Kwela Books, 2004, also published by Permanent Black in New Delhi in 2004 and 2005. She is also the editor in The Shadow of the Mahatma, A Granddaughter Remembers, Calcutta, New Delhi, also London, Sampak, 2005. Please, ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Professor Uma Maestri.
Thank you very much, Kikina, for that introduction. As I sit here in Cape Town on a very cold, blustery day, I can imagine Professor Fatima Meer dressed in a sari with a smile on her face as she looks with some pride at the two young academics who pioneered this memorial lecture, Drs. Nadbi and Sidat Khan. She would have also marveled at the incisiveness with which Shireen Hassam has crafted her biography and raised public awareness of her as a scholar of significant note, a profile that adds to her well-known profile as a public figure. In this lecture, Shireen has also presented an outstanding inaugural lecture, and only the brave or foolish will follow her to speak after her. But Shireen has aptly subtitled her book, A Free Mind. And I think that is something, I think the term comes from Nelson Mandela, and it is something that one should aspire to, a free mind. Her introductory biographical essay, which I read when the book was released, I thought was brilliant. And this week in rereading it, I just thought this essay sizzles with sharp insights. Only Shireen could have done Meer such justice. And I think Prof. Meer would have been very happy with this, the dominance of females on this panel. And I wanted to talk about myself a little bit and to share a few anecdotes that illustrate the very high regard I held for Professor Meer as a young academic. In 1978, I was in search of a topic for my master's degree. And while I could not register at the University of Natal without a permit and had registered at the University of Durban-Westville, I nonetheless sought out Professor Meer's guidance, as she was also a family friend. She immediately suggested that I work on the protector of Indian immigrants who was supposedly there to see to the needs and complaints of indentured workers, but was anything but that. I was so fired up by this conversation with Professor Meer and excitedly proposed to the history department at the University of Durban, Westville, that I wanted Professor Meer as my joint supervisor. But like Meer, who could never get approval for her own choice of doctoral subject, my proposal for the topic and the joint supervision was actually shot down. I went on to complete my master's on another topic more suitable to the department, while Meer went on to complete an edited book in 1980 titled Documents of Indentured Labor. Ironically, a few years later, the new head of department at the University of Durban, Westville, Professor Surendra Bana, and my supervisor of my master's thesis, Professor Brain, began a major project on the ship's lists of indentured arrivals. While this move at the University of Durban, Westville is heralded as a key moment in the revitalization of the study of indentured labor, Professor Meer was ahead then as she was in so many other instances. Another anecdote is of some significance. In 1971, while a high school student, I attended a youth camp at Gandhi's Phoenix settlement. And throughout the day, one had lectures from a variety of individuals, lectures aimed at providing an alternate education to the one in schools. Professor Meer was one of those who came, but she came as an artist, and she taught us teenagers how to make tie-dye t-shirts. The work camps were initiated in 1971 by two of Professor Meer's colleagues, Laurie Schlemmer and Rick Turner, together with Mewa and Ila Ramgobin at Phoenix. And they must form part of the story of scholar activism in Durban in the early 1970s. It also adds another dimension to Meer's engagements. The paint buckets of many colors, and not words this time, were a medium for change. From Meer's own writings and Shireen Hassam's analysis, there are important points one gleams about Meer as a scholar. The past was important to uncover the present context. The past was important to uncover. The present context was important to how that past was to be represented. And the goal was always a vision for a more just future. Writing was an act of activism. This she made very evident in her motivation for writing Portrait of Indian South Africans in 1969. And I just want to quote here at some length. She writes in profile of the Portrait of Indian South Africa. In South Africa, there is a need for those who share the country to know each other. Opportunities for interpersonal contact between their members are less today than ever before. And as each community becomes residentially barricaded into its own little homeland or group area, the written word becomes increasingly more important as a channel of meaningful contact. And then follows a paragraph in which she urges Indian South Africans to reach out and make contact with fellow South Africans in the hope, too, that South Africans will recognize themselves in the lives of their fellows. Now, this is an important, I've seen in other books, there's a lack of such a significant introduction, but this book is marked by such a clear project of why she went about doing this book. There was an urgency on Meer's part to document struggles and conflicts and to provide an alternate narrative to state narratives about resistance and violence. And this actually stimulated the data collection in the Resistance in Townships volume and the analysis of the Inanda riots in 1985. Now, Shamim and Shireen have both alluded to what Meer would have done in July 2021. And I have to say this very same thought would have came to my mind, that central to Meer's objectives was to create an archive that produced different narratives to the mainstream and that challenged simple explanations for violence. I'm actually glad that Shireen spent some time defining the term scholar activist, as it is quite helpful. Much of Meer's scholarly activism and publications were in the apartheid era. And there are numerous examples of such scholar activism in this period. I think especially about the academics working for the Surplus Peoples Project, who documented the scope of forced removals and community struggles, and who facilitated access to lawyers. The archive they created is voluminous. Now, in the democratic era, many scholars became active in supporting and individuals and communities seeking land restitution, in pushing for transformation of archives and museums, in pursuing the repatriation of human remains from museums in Europe. Disillusioned with the trajectory of democracy, scholars also became active in housing struggles, and writings pointed out the similarities of apartheid-style removals with that of removals under democratically elected local councils. There is a significant body of work that is transformative, scholarly, and matched by information collecting. Now, one of the most outstanding examples of scholar activism in the Western Cape was my colleague, Martin Legasik. And I was struck by his own analysis of his academic work and his work as activist. He writes proudly about standing with protesting informal settlement dwellers and being harassed by the police, and he documents this. This is an important part of his activism, namely writing about housing struggles and standing on the same line as the people. Yet when Martin Legasik writes about appearing before the Lands Claims Commission as a witness in a land claim hearing, his work to transform the McGregor Museum and the repatriation of human remains from Vienna, he sees these as works of accident, where his pure academic research, as he called it, came to have a use, and he terms this involvement as an involvement in applied history. I would like to argue with Martin that all this work is consistent with his profile as scholar activist. Just as it was significant to stand with the communities in the informal settlements, that's how important it was to also appear as a witness in a court case. And it is important also to note that I think academic work can have residual activist potential, and it could become part of activist campaigns years and decades after the work was produced. So as Martin says, producing work, pure academic research, he described it as that. It has the potential for activism. And I wanted to refer to my own involvement in the group areas removals in Cape Town. And in the 1990s, I steeped myself in the files of the group areas board, and I interviewed forced removal communities and wrote about the removals in Black River. More than 20 years later, after this research, the Rondebosch Golf Course sought renewal of its lease of land from the City Council. A campaign to block this renewal was started by Indifuna Ulwazi, a group seeking to challenge spatial inequalities in Cape Town. I was able to locate a 1955 document from a representative of the Rondebosch golf course, which received very wide publicity in the media and in this campaign against the renewal of the lease, which showed its complicity with its apartheid and the enthusiasm with which it was supportive of group areas and forced removals in Rondebosch. And this is an example of research that comes to have activist potential years after it was written. And as Martin would say, it was written by accident. And it was by accident that it came into public use and for the public good. But I would not use his term applied history, which I found to be a deeply problematic term. I have to agree with Shireen's despondency about university managerialism and how this impacts on the work of scholars. But I also want to point out that when academics apply for promotion, there is a fourth category that actually comes last, which is called community work. I think at the University of the Western Cape, we have often celebrated this kind of community work. And what we need to do for all those sitting on promotion panels is to pay particular attention to this category alongside the categories of research and teaching and learning. Shireen has raised some very important questions at the end of her lecture about where to now and what now. So I wanted to conclude on a slightly more optimistic note about how Meer's scholarly activism is being taken further. And I want to draw on the work of my colleague in the history department at the University of Cape Town, where Connie Benson, who calls herself a feminist historian and housing activist, and who is actually much more than these two descriptions. She has detailed how research about communities can be a collaborative exercise. Working with Faiza Meer, a backyard dweller who occupied public land with others, she got Meer to write a diary. This diary was often spoken aloud, and the diary often took the form of SMSs to Connie or WhatsApp messages. And Connie then provided a context for what was happening in this particular land invasion. And in this way, Meer became a co-author of an important story of land invasion. And Benson's role was to facilitate this. So from land occupier, land invader, Meer became an author documenting her own involvement in this. And I think that I would like to end with a note about boundary setting between scholar activists and communities. And this important quote comes from a shack dweller, Lorraine Hunis, and it is cited by Connie Benson. And it is a very strong message for the scholar activists to take note of. We are poor, but we are not stupid. We don't need you to take decisions for us because we live in informal settlements and you have skills and resources, but we can use your help. Thank you very much.
How do you say that in good English? You're hitting hard, ladies. You're hitting hard. We hear you. We hear you. Before we continue, thank you so much. I would like to introduce a documentary film about Professor Meer, and then we will go to the question and answer session. And this documentary film has been made possible, and we would like to pay respect or say thank you to SABC3 for us to be able to access it. I will step back, and I hope you're going to watch the DVD, the video.
The late Fatima Meer was born on the 12th of August 1928, and on the 90th anniversary of her birth, Mela would like to pay tribute to the memory of a most remarkable woman.
Her birth in Durban in 1928 made it inevitable that Fatima Meer should be subjected to the evils and indignities of a racially segregated society. But her decision to fight the system was her own choice, and one in which she never wavered. Her courage was, however, just one aspect of her personality, and her creativity deserves closer inspection.
In South Africa's struggle for freedom, we remember certain people, but one area that's often forgotten are the women that were involved in the struggle. Today, we pay tribute to one particular woman, Fatima Meer, who is not only a struggle icon, but also a painter and a writer. Plus, we celebrate her birthday.
Education was a priority for Fatima's family, and she attended Durban Indian Girls High School. At age 16, she was already raising funds for famine relief in Bengal, and she met her future husband, Ismail Meer, where they participated in the Indian Passive Resistance Campaign in 1946. Both she and her husband were active in the Congress Alliance and the Defiance Campaign, and her activism led to her being backed. She never backed down, and in 1976, she spent 6 months in the then women's jail, which now forms part of the Constitution Hill complex in Johannesburg. It was during this time that she began to document the life of her fellow prisoners visually, and her work now forms part of a permanent exhibition at the precinct.
Fatima's paintings represented her everyday surroundings. So a lot of them were painted with scenes of Johannesburg and what you could see from within the prison walls.
Freedom remained tantalizingly close but inaccessible. Many of the women were political prisoners, including Fatima's longtime comrade and friend, Mama Winnie Mandela. As an artist and chronicler, Fatima made no attempt to prettify life in jail. Instead of painting flowers, as the authorities had instructed, she chose to reflect everyday reality and the way in which the inmates battled the soul-destroying tedium and loneliness of imprisonment. The cells contain artifacts from this era, providing context for the artworks on display and a hint of what life was like for Fatima and her fellow activists during this time.
What we see at Constitution Hill is simply a representation of Fatima Meer. But one of the things that can never be broken is a bond between a mother and a daughter, no matter the distance or the adversity that they have to endure. Today, I get to spend a little bit of time with Fatima Meer's daughter to get to know the woman behind the paintings.
Having earned a master's degree in sociology, Fatima Meer was appointed to the staff of the University of Natal and later became a fellow of the London School of Economics. She received 2 honorary doctorates for her work to promote human and women's rights, while also raising 3 children, Shamin, Rashid, and Shanaz, who made the law her career.
Judge Meer, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on Mela. What drove her to become part of the struggle?
She came from a family that had a very strong sense of social justice, and this was imbued in her at a very early age. Her father was a journalist. He brought up his large family to be aware of issues of the day, the injustices around them. And my mother just soaked this in, and this translated into whatever she achieved throughout her life.
What was the turning moment for her? What got her involved in the struggle?
At the age of 17, as a young woman, she made her first political speech. It was during the Passive Resistance Campaign, and perhaps that might have been one of the turning moments for her.
I actually read quite an interesting story once about your mom taking you to different parts of Durban with your brother and sister to explore the city and to paint.
My mother was a very adventurous person. She was an academic. She was an artist. She's written the script for a Bollywood film. My mother wrote plays. She's even scripted a dance drama. In addition to that, she has written at least some 40 academic journals. She has lectured all over the world as an academic. Now, all of this added up to an extraordinary human being. So when you say she took us to paint and she took us to do all these kind of things, yes, she did. But to us, that seemed pretty normal because that was the only mother we knew. But there was this kind of dichotomy. Because on the one hand, there was this person who could do anything. But on the other hand, there was a very strong traditional and conventional side to her. She was very rooted in tradition, in family, in the Indian community.
Tell me a little bit more about your mom's books and this recent book.
Perhaps one of the best known books is the first biography of Nelson Mandela, Higher Than Hope. Whilst he was in prison, Mandela requested her to come and see him, and he asked her if she would take on the writing of Higher Than Hope. And perhaps I can just read something to you about what is said in her biography. I'm going to read what Winnie Mandela says in the foreword. When Comrade Nelson Mandela was moved to Victor Verster in Paarl after 1988, I received a message that he wanted to see me urgently. On that occasion, he said he wanted to see Fatima to ask her to write his biography. Fatima had followed Madiba's instructions to be brutally honest and had researched Madiba's private life and his numerous indiscretions. Oliver Tambo was furious and demanded that all the chapters dealing with this be expunged. Fatima and I did just that, but she later told me that she kept those pages somewhere in a vault in the bank.
Your parents were quite influential in your path of development. I mean, you've now become a lawyer, you're a judge, and you're changing the world through law.
They imbued in all three of their children a very strong sense of social responsibility. And I think that informed all our decisions in life and whatever we did.
She wore a sari at every occasion that she could. Why was that?
My mother was a woman of great style, great elegance, great beauty. And she had an eye for beautiful clothes, fabrics, saris. She was an Indian woman of her time. And sari is a beautiful garment.
Considering that we are in Women's Month and it is your mom's birthday, what message do you think your mom would have for the women of South Africa?
Be champions against injustice and be warriors of the poor and speak out against injustice. When reasonable men and women remain silent, evil flourishes.
What message do you have for the youth of South Africa?
Be your best selves and live lives of integrity and dignity.
Judge Mia, thank you so much for sharing stories of your mom with us and giving a little bit of insight into her life. From us, I would say, as South Africans, it's important for us to remember the people that were involved in South Africa's fight for freedom and to use their lives as examples for us moving forward.
Women are practical. They see the problem and they go and work in trying to solve that problem.
Powerful, powerful. Siyabonga kakhulu. Thank you so much. I hope you've been enjoying and learning and listening and feeling that hope is being reignited here tonight. I think I was just remembering that book, Higher Than Hope, when they talked about it in the documentary, because I truly feel that hope is being reignited in us during this inaugural memorial lecture honoring the great Professor Fatima Meer. And we feel like we're back at school. I'm grateful that there is a time for questions and answers. So we also know that this whole session is being streamed live on YouTube. I hope you're enjoying it on YouTube. It will also constantly be available on the YouTube channel of the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Now I'd like to open the floor for those questions. We'll try and give 3 questions and then take it from there. 3 questions at a time. We may start. There's a question that says, there's a comment that says members of the public would like to make any contributions to the archive. They can email to there's a message from the university. They can make a contribution to the archive. The email address is Fatima Meer archives@ukzn.ac.za. Another comment says, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box. Thank you. And there's another message says, remember, if you have any questions, please. Okay, that's the same. I'm going to go to the Q&A side of things now. The question comes from Thokozani Mkhize. There is a video of an interview with Professor Fatima Meer, which was taken on the 1st of September 2008, titled, How Have Things Changed Since the Early 1990s? She said, the biggest challenge is that of eliminating poverty and establishing equality. That was her response. Another quotation is, education is the foundation of eliminating poverty. What has the South African government achieved in addressing these 2 challenges concerning differently abled students, conventionally known as students living with disabilities? This also refers to the accessibility of higher education as a foundation of poverty alleviation and accessibility of infrastructure at higher education institutions. For example, lecture theaters, libraries, space for electric wheelchair users, modified ICT researchers. This is one question. Another one is social media. Social media decries lack of empathy and non-responsiveness of some study supervisors. How do you think Professor Meer would address the growing concern experienced by up and coming researchers? I'll leave it at that because those are very strong questions. I'll continue. I think that is addressed to our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Chair. Some very difficult questions. I can't speak to very much to the infrastructure for people with various disabilities and mobility issues at all universities. I know that at Wits University there were serious attempts to transform spaces, but as always, not adequately so. So I can't say much more than that. On the issue of the empathy and lack of empathy, lack of responsiveness by supervisors, I suppose that is a very general and old problem. And I think there have always been some supervisors who took more interest in students' work and some who were just not really, interested in it. I can't, again, answer this in the abstract, but obviously if there's something we can take away from the way in which Professor Meer created her cohort of students, I think what I saw, in the Institute for Black Research was kind of quite a lot of willingness to give students direction and to push them towards asking the right kind of questions, but also expecting that the researchers, the students, would jump in at the deep end and get on with it, right? So I think my sense of her and my own personal interaction with her when I was a graduate student, I didn't ever work for her, but she was certainly someone I engaged with, and she was very intolerant of people who didn't just get on with the job. Maybe because she herself had to get on with it herself, as I think I was trying to say. So, of course, we always, as supervisors, have to do the very best that we can to support students and to create the conditions that would be most conducive to them pursuing their work independently, but with guidance from a supervisor.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think some of it as well has to do with COVID-19 and how many students have had to find data somehow and find Wi-Fi and find a way of continuing with their studies without ever setting foot in a lecture room. So I think that's also some of those difficulties that young people have had to deal with. Let me see, what is the other question that comes up? Another question, Professor Meer was an astute researcher, objective in her approach and an academic of note. How can these values be inculcated in today's academics as they moderate, mentor young professionals? Does UKZN have a note in this regard? If yes, please explain. There's one question. Question number 2. Do we need a new type of activist, seeing the Constitution and the laws cannot be implemented? Monitored and evaluated? The poor have become more poor. The socio-economic status of the majority of our communities is far from improved. The voice of NGOs and community-based organizations is not heard despite having laws and regulations. The scholar activist can survive if the above changes have been made. Thanks for the presentations. Okay.
Do you want me to try and answer that? Or do you want to ask? I mean, I do think that that scholar activists can do a lot of things, but they can't change everything. They don't actually, in that sense, have the power to produce on their own a more equal society. That I think that scholar activists do actually highlight the issues of poverty and the poor status of most people in South Africa. Interestingly, a lot of that kind of research, in fact, is taking place in NGOs and not just in the universities, right? So if I think about the sort of gap between the constitutional ideals and the real lives of people on the ground, that kind of work is happening in places like Section 27, in Seri, in Dufuna, Ukwazi, and Ground Up as spaces in which there is some kind of research. I would like to say that within the university setting, we can do more ambitious and long-term studies that work with those groups. We can initiate projects from the university space that work with those groups. But in terms of that mobilization that's necessary, we really do need what Fatima Meer pointed out, we need a thriving social movement space. You know, and I say that with due regard to that's a really awful situation in KwaZulu-Natal of assassinations, political assassinations, which really makes the conditions of activism so difficult for so many people. Yeah, so I don't know that we need a new type of activist. I think that is the traditional role, Dr. Motwahai. I think we just need to think about how we can do it better and who it is that we work with.
Yeah, Professor Mishri, you want to say something, please?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this is a really good question to ask, because we are celebrating scholarly activism, but we have to ask the question, how successful is this? You know, what are the effects of it on the lives of the majority of people? So I like the question a lot. And I think it is a difficult question to answer because it varies in different instances. So for instance, in Cape Town, and the campaign against the Rondebosch golf course, which got so much publicity, it couldn't have got any more publicity in Cape Town, but it failed because the Rondebosch golf club's lease was actually renewed. But there was another campaign which was on the Tafelberg sale, the sale of public land by the provincial government to a private person. And there was a massive campaign there that was based on research on Sea Point as an exclusive white enclave and so forth. And that also got a lot of traction. And in that particular case, that campaign was successful. At the most, a lot of the activism results in making cases very high profile. And so they get a lot of attention because the activists work on the media and on getting the issues publicized very effectively. And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't work. So it is, I think it's a good question to start analyzing this. When is it successful and when does it fail?
There's also the wonderful, wonderful work that is very scholarly, actually, that's taking place around the basic income grant, in which people are really using their economic skills. They're beginning to do some modeling of the alternatives, of the cost, and so on. So they are using the professional skills that we have, as a kind of supportive set of research to the campaigns for income guarantees. There are successful examples in the present of scholar activism.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm going to take two more questions. I think these are the last two questions. Thank you to the presenters for providing us with rich insights into the scholarly activist work of Professor Meer. It highlights the importance of the role of the university as a public good and importance of community engagement for engaged scholarship. Her scholarly activism approach is that of a public sociology approach to sociology, as discussed in the writing of Michael Burawoy. I don't know how to say that name. Burawoy. How do you say it?
Burawoy.
Burawoy. Imagine if we had it would be so much easier. Anyway. And then the last question comes from, that one was from Desiree Maricon, and then this one is from Fazana Bashiri. Thanks for the very interesting session. Do you see any difference between the South African scholar activism and Western scholar activism? or what do you see that the scholar activism of Fatima Meer can add or alter in the tasks put forth by right? Thank you. Those are the last two questions.
So Michael Burawoy developed his public sociology idea very much based on what he encountered in South Africa. Actually, it sort of really inspired him. It's an interesting example of how South Africa was a kind of model for global scholarship, because he was very inspired by what he saw, particularly in the sociology of labor movement and the work in South Africa, and developed this theory of public sociology. So, you know, I think that's right. This is Michael Burawoy's approach is his theory of the public sociologist is really important. I have always felt that in all the literature developing the idea of public sociology, there was actually, and I say this in the book, the real neglect of the Institute for Black Research actually in mapping that field. And it troubled me no end, Desiree, that kind of model, which was slightly different to the model of working with trade unions, you know, didn't feature in that mapping. But yes, no, absolutely. I think South African scholar activism has been a kind of a model for many people around the world. It's something that has always been admired, and the passion that comes with intellectual debates in South Africa is actually unmatched. It's still the case that the stakes are always so high if you go to an academic seminar in South Africa in any of the social sciences or humanities, because so often we're talking about the fundamental issues of our society. So, you know, do I see a difference between South African scholar activism and Western scholar activism? I tend not to use such stark divisions between those. I think many leftist communities around the world do what we do. Maybe it is the case that in other parts of the world, they have that idea of being right in the crucible of the political moment. You know, we were fortunate. For those of us who were writing in the 70s and the 80s, I would say, you know, Professor Meer was really fortunate because she fought for something and she saw that crumble. She saw that evil formal Oedipus of apartheid crumble. So like she got us to that point, right? She was fortunate. She was part of that fortunate generation. They worked for something and they built something. Of course, whether we have betrayed that promise, whether we have what we have done with it subsequently is a different matter. But at least I think she had the advantage of knowing that what she did made a difference. Other leftist scholarly communities complain in other parts of the world of the sort of extent to which they are not heard, right? Where they're not given a voice in society. I'm not entirely arguing with you, Farzana. I think that, you know, there are contextual differences. But I think the tasks put forward by Eric Olin-Wright are pretty much the tasks all around the world for scholar activists. So he was not talking about South Africa specifically.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I also would like to add that there's also the activism of remembering. There are so many people who've contributed so much into this country in the past century or more that we tend to forget. We choose not to even mention their names, not to even think about their contribution, the hard work they contributed to this country. I would like to commend people like Dr. Xolisa Guzula and Dr. Atambile Masola from UCT, who have written book after book about women who have been forgotten. And so it is extremely important. They keep saying, Asina Gutula, we shall not be quiet. We shall not forget. And some of those women are people like Uma Monogukanya Lutuli. If South Africa can forget Mama Nogukanya Lutuli, they can forget anybody. If they can forget the likes of Mama Nogutela Mdima and forget the likes of Mama Charlotte Maklege or the great Krotoa Eva and so many other names, if they can forget them, they can forget anything. So the activism of remembering is crucial for me. We can talk about all kinds of, there are many kinds of poverty. There's also poverty of honoring her story. That's what I would say. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we are moving as shiny as hand. Hey, I wish we could do a major applause because we've had a fabulous keynote speaker and her respondent. We are so grateful. For me, just alone. Thank you. Now I think we are moving to the presentation of the Clinical Sociology Book Prize. It shall be presented by Professor Mariam Sidat Khan.
Thank you, Dr. Mshokwe. Good evening and a very warm welcome to the 2022 and first Clinical Sociology postgraduate student cohort group, parents, guardians, family, friends, and colleagues. Winnie Mandela candidly reflects on Professor Fatima Meer in the foreword of Memories of Struggle, published in 2017, and I quote, she says, "I personally felt she deserved more recognition than she was given. But of course, ours is still a patriarchal society in which men are more recognized than women. I hope that we will correct that situation with all our might as women. If Fatima Meer was alive today, she would be contributing robustly to the current national debate about the grave problems we are faced with today, such as the rumored state capture, corruption, and graft. I admired her open mind and the fact that she was a free spirit. We at UKZN and the broader academic community are grateful to Winnie Mandela for having the foresight of tasking us as women with correcting that situation. Madiba said of Professor Fatima Meer that she was totally liberated and an emancipated soul. Her close friendship saw her providing leadership advice when asked and tasked with writing Higher Than Hope. Professor Fatima Meer was an early Southern sociologist, human rights activist, gender activist, community organizer, and a prisoner of apartheid. The apartheid prison system was instrumental and intended to dehumanize and deconscientize the likes of Prof. Meer. However, every single apartheid prisoner returned apartheid's brutality with reconciliation and love and commitment to the country. Using the writing of Professor Fatima Meer, she expresses her love for life by her repeated reference to bluer than the blue sea and bluer than the blue sky. Albeit long overdue, this afternoon we're here as UKZN to celebrate Professor Fatima Meer's intellectual contribution to public sociology. We begin in small part writing her thorny past and complex institutional relationship by inaugurating the Professor Fatima Meer Clinical Sociology Book Prize. This prestigious accolade is conferred on a laureate with exceptional theoretical, clinical, applied, micro, macro, and multidisciplinary knowledge that underscores change. Laureates must subscribe to professional and ethical values advanced by Prof. Meer. As a second step to Professor Meer's memory. The University of KwaZulu-Natal's Dr. Naika from Quality Assurance, Dr. Govender from Industrial and Labour Studies, and myself have undertaken to deliver a master's in applied and clinical sociology in 2023. The vision for a clinical sociology program was born under the mentorship of Professor Fatima Meer, where I served between 1990 and 1992 at the Institute for Black Research. As a master's candidate, I worked tirelessly conducting research, driving Prof. Meer around, filing, sorting, cleaning, archiving, literature reviews, all under the instruction of by Prof. Meer. Fondly referred to as Auntie Ben, had unreasonable deadlines, which were closely supervised by Ramesh and surprisingly delivered on time with great respect and fear, I might add. Prof. Meer's legacy authenticates a prodigious commitment to resolving social problems through clinical interventions in marginalized community, drawing on them as citizen scientists. The inaugural clinical sociology program, an eminent master's program, receives unyielding support from the International Sociological Association's RC 46 Clinical Sociology, Professor Jan Fritz, University of Cincinnati, and UN representative, the Association for Applied and Clinical Sociology, and Professor Tina Ace of the University of Johannesburg, founder of the first KPAX accredited undergraduate program in Africa, serves as UKZN's external examiner and evaluator for the program. I'm pleased to report that after rigorous review, the Commission on the Accreditation of Programs in Applied and Clinical Sociology has extended an invitation to the UKZN graduate program in Applied and Clinical Sociological Practice for accreditation. If the KPAX application for accreditation is successful, UKZN will become one of 3 internationally accredited postgraduate programs in the world. Acknowledging and extending gratitude to dedicated teams of people and individuals begins with Principal Officer from Teaching and Learning, Ms. Hazel Rampal, based on the Pietermaritzburg campus, Library Scientist, Claudette Kerseval, Corporate Affairs Extraordinaire, Ms. Melissa Mungru, and a special thanks to Professor Ujong, Hoskins, Nena Amin, and Danpat, who provide invaluable sustained institutional and financial support. The combined efforts of both professional and academic staff seek to advance the intellectual project. In October 2021, the unknown Applied and Clinical Sociology program received an overwhelming response of 98 applications. 20 students were invited to read for the honors degree in clinical sociology. Colleagues, parents, family, friends, and students, after careful assessment of all 20 submissions, I take great pleasure in handing over to my colleague and friend, Dr. Jay Govender, to introduce and announce the shortlisted candidates. Dr. Govender.
Good evening, colleagues. Thank you, Miriam. Good evening, Dr. Slope. Thank you very much for your handling of the proceedings. My thanks also to fellow colleagues, Shireen Hassim and Umar Dupelia Meshri, and of course the Meer family, distinguished colleagues and friends from all over. The adjudication process of this award was framed against Fatima Meer's intellectual style that we've been talking about, the scholar activist. We couldn't think of anything more than that, because to our own surprise, that the first cohort of students actually consisted of a great majority of the so-called scholar activists. We think it might be influenced by the discipline itself, or by some other kind of concern. But it's interesting when we looked at the profiles, of the cohort of students. What we did actually find were that many of them were actually immersed in the community and involved in some form of community activity, and actually, conducting some kind of activism. So I'm really pleased that the award actually goes to 2 students on this very, very first occasion. We hope that this, intellectually symbolic sort of, effort on our part would grow into something much more larger and something which would become an internationally recognized gesture within the UKZN. So I'm really pleased, Professor Ojong, these are your students, by the way, and thank you for sending very good students to us. We've listened to you. We've listened to the idea of professionalizing our qualifications, making them very relevant, towards career pathing and so on. And I think we are well underway towards achieving that goal. So the 2 students are Swazi Kiswayo, and the second is Mohammed Baradeen. Prof. Ojong, you'd be happy to know that both of them are, as I said, involved in the community. Swazi has, in her study during this honors program, was an attempt to correlate the SARS coronavirus with youth suicide, and we thought that this was a fascinating study, and we thought also that we needed to support Swazi in this line of study. The second area of study by Mohammed had to do with how people under distress survive, and in particular reference to the KwaZulu-Natal floods. So here's a crisis situation in which people are forced to survive under very difficult circumstances. Both these topics are highly significant and relevant for the South African context as well as the international context, where we experience several forms of disasters, natural disasters, and including the COVID-19 and so on. So I'm happy to present the award to the 2 students. We've retained the term laureate. So I'm going to say that these are our first 2 laureates for the Fatima Meer, Professor Fatima Meer Clinical Sociology Book Prize. Thank you very much. The 2 candidates may wish to say a few words if they are happy to do so. I could begin with Swazi, if you'd like to go first.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm extremely humbled to share the prestigious Fatima Meer Book Prize with my classmate Mohammed. When Professor stated kind join the memorial lecture committee,
Maybe ucishe ivideo wensebenzisa ivoice kuphela. Maybe i-Wi-Fi iyasindwa.
I wonder if our technical colleagues can assist.
It seems that
Dr.
Swazi's actually lost connection. She's not online at the moment. Maybe Mohammed wants to speak for a bit while we
Dr. Shlope, through you, I have Ms. Swazi has sent me her a few words she'd like me to read on her behalf. Is that okay, Chair?
Yes, please, we'd like that very much.
And I read verbatim. I'm extremely humbled to share this prestigious Fatima Meer Book Prize with my classmate Mohammed. When Professor Sidat invited me to join the Memorial Lecture Committee, I was surprised. As a young Black woman and community activist, was I finally being recognized for efforts that came naturally to me? Much like sociologist Professor Meer, yet on a smaller scale, I fight tirelessly to prevent suicide, encouraging youth to seek treatment and help for depression. As an undergraduate psychology major, I paid little attention to applied and clinical sociology. I was socialized to consider becoming a doctor, a lawyer, engineer, teacher, social worker, or psychologist. My options were limited. Toward the end of 2021, I saw a call for clinical sociology applications. It read, contact Professor Sidat for program details. The rest, as they say, is history. On Wednesday, the 16th of February, 2022, during the online orientation, I recognized Prof. Sidat and Dr. Govinder's sincere interest in the state of community. We were challenged to employ a sociological imagination and recognize our role as community change agents. I think I needed someone to believe in me. Thank you, Prof. Sidat and Dr. Govinder, for believing in me. I'm encouraged by both of you and extremely grateful for your critical yet valued support. I'm not always thrilled with either of you and your tight deadlines. However, I'm grateful for the potential that you see in me. I want to thank you both for making me believe that I can make a difference. I would like to wish my fellow laureate Mohammed well for his research project. Prof. Sidat Khan and Dr. Govinder, I'll be back in 2023 for the Masters in Clinical Sociology. Thank you to my parents, siblings, family, and friends for your continued support. Thank you.
Mohammed, do you want to proceed?
Yeah, just have a few words. I'm exceptionally honored and grateful to receive such and share this prestigious award. Growing up in Old Port, Durban, I frequently remember hearing family talk about the magnanimous Professor Fatima Meer. I came to recognize her altruistic role as an activist who fought tirelessly against apartheid. During the third year of my undergraduate degree, while reading for a contemporary social theory module, I was introduced to her writings by her grandniece, Professor Sidat Khan. I was increasingly curious about her sociological research and began exploring her writings independently. I discovered Professor Fatima Meer, her writings on suicide, which demonstrated advanced thinking and ability to disrupt traditional thinking, much like her grandniece, Professor Sidat Khan, who has taught me very well. Professor Meer's legacy continues to affect the lives of all South Africans. If you had told me in February 2022, especially after my first honors seminar, that I would be nominated for this prestigious award, I would have probably expressed amusement. I thought Professor Sidat Khan and Dr. Govinder had unrealistic academic expectations from us. Have they not heard of downtime? How was I going to complete all the prescribed readings and additional readings? It was a lot. We managed to do so. I braced myself for 2022, and my singular 2022 goal was set to excel academically. Motivated by taskmasters Professor Sidat Khan and Dr. Govinder, I worked diligently, questioning everything, and I mean everything. I'm in all honesty indebted to Professor Sidat Khan and Dr. Govinder, both of whom offer critical and constructive responses that enhance my academic performance. As one of two students honors class representatives, I want to extend my personal thanks for the time that the academic team has and continues to invest into personal academic successes, which has encouraged academic excellence on all of us. On behalf of the 2022 Clinical Sociological Cohort, we want to express our gratitude and thank you. Finally, to all my classmates, it has been an absolute pleasure, and I wish us all well as we approach the final submission deadline. Professor Sida Khan and Dr. Governor, I personally look forward to pursuing a Master's in Clinical Sociology 2023. Last but not least, thank you to my parents and my sister for your continued support. Thank you.
Yeah, that is fabulous, fabulous. If we were in a big venue now, we'd be hearing major applause. And so you're gonna just hear from one individual. Bravo, keep up the good work. And the spirit of Professor Fatima Meer is here with us, and she's smiling and celebrating both of you. Thank you. I would like to now invite Dr. Maserole Hari Masondo to give us a summation and the vote of thanks.
Mamu Fatima, Mother Fatima, Professor Meer, the unifier, the sociologist, a mentor, community development icon, the scholar activist, umuntu, intombi, engumuntu. We salute you today. The great stylish woman, the woman of beauty, the woman of love, the woman of care, the woman of respect, the woman who believed in participation. Oh, the woman who believed in social justice. Today, we just want to thank the spirit of Mama Fatima Meer. Greetings, everyone. My job at this moment is a very, must I say, difficult Mamu Thina. I think
it's easy. It's not easy.
It's not easy. It's not easy.
Ow.
Yeah, I used to watch it.
Yes.
You know, it is a privilege today to be sitting here and representing the committee that have organized this powerful lecture. As it is just an inauguration, is going to be a lecture forever. Even our children, you know, all every child that will be born after, I don't know when, will be celebrating our mother. So what I can start by saying is a quote by James Allen. James Allen says, "No duty is more urgent than that of returning thanks." As I was seated here listening to Prof. Shireen, listening to Prof. Umar, you know, I was just jumping, saying, Lord, I wish I can just say thank you. I wish I can just, you know, Yulile saying, because of the powerful, rigorous delivery of the lecture. It was very exciting, and you know, even the messages that they delivered, the knowledge that they gave us today, they are aligned with the principles and the values of Mama Fatima Meer. So after 6 years of incubating the birthing of the lecture, today it is alive. Therefore, it is imperative to appreciate everyone who contributed to this incubation and birthing process. You know, in Hindi, I went to India at some point because India is in me. And I like it when you said, my sister, my sister Shamim, that Ma used to wear saris. You can see I'm also wearing a sari. So in Hindi, when they say thank you, they will say Bahud Danyavad. So I want to say Bahud Danyavad to everyone who is here. Thank you very much. To the family of Umama, Professor Umir, Sis Shamim, I heard you mentioned Shariz, you mentioned Rashid, the grandchildren Uzen Marie, and the granddaughter Nadia Meer. We just want to thank you as the committee and UKZN for graciously allowing us to honor the legacy of your mother, the legacy of your grandmother, the legacy of aunt, the legacy of sister, as you have said, Shamim. We know as a committee, we know as UKZN and the community at large, that, it is a scar. While we are busy narrating, while the lecture is continuing, some of you there and friends, there are tears thinking about this loved one. But we just want to assure you that behind every scar, there is a star. Out of the scar of losing Mama, now as a nation and globally, we are now able to tap into the life of this legend, and we are able to look at the wrongs that we see in South Africa, and through the life of Mama, we will be able to make it a point that we correct where we can. And what is important is the fact that family, you have agreed with all of your hearts. And you said to us, as you said, my sister Shamim, Mommy belonged to the nation. We share Mommy with everyone. So we just want to say, Siyabonga, Danki, thank you, Bahud, Daha, Bad. To Professor Hasim, all the way from Canada, showing that our legend is international. And to you, Prof. Uma, all the way from Cape Town. The committee said, I must say to you, it was not easy to choose who to call today to deliver this inaugural lecture. But because of you being astute academics, you being like Mama Fatima Meer, we felt that you will be able to represent who she was, and you will be able to model who she was, even in your presentation. Indeed, as the committee, we want to say to you, you never failed us. While you were presenting, it was as if our icon was alive. Even the way you were talking, the mannerism, we just felt, I know the committee, they just felt, what an accomplishment. Thank you for honoring our legend. And thank you for the fact that you were able to go deep and get information about her, and also do a reflection, self-study, because I heard she taught you and you have been with her for many years. What I will summarize from what has been said is that you indicated that we need to balance theory and action to ensure that quality activist scholarship is realized. and that activism is part of the way of life of the social justice advocate, which, when we look at Umama Fatima Meer, indeed, from what you have deliberated, indeed, we have seen that throughout her life and what you have reflected, women of honor, the two of you, is that Umama was motivated by her moral values. You can read everything around the books and whatever, but you can see a moralistic, a humanist who was able to stand for justice, who was able to unite people. She fought to unite Indians and Africans. Even today, there are still issues about the infights between Indians and Africans. And what even the video stipulated is the fact that, Mama said, it is very important that women stand up. She believed that women can stand and help in resolving these issues. And from what you have delivered, I was so impressed that you were able to deliver a lecture that was not compromising, a lecture that was not romanticizing. And you were able to bring to the fore what I will call Ubuntu, that Umama had. And from your lecture, you are really informing the community that is listening, even the whole globe, because Umama Hasimu professor is representing the world internationally. That the two of you are saying to us, it's very important that we look at Umama and Buntulize the whole globe, bring love, care, respect, and ensure that we unite and live and look beyond race. Also, what you mentioned that is very critical is that, scholar activists must address community issues in their research. And that is very critical because indeed, our research in academia, they are not accessible many a time. We just write and they are in the libraries, and we don't practice whatever we have written. We don't practice in the communities. So the challenges that you have brought today by bringing Mama alive to us is to tell us as academics that we must arise and be community engaged scholars, using our research to go and work in communities. The theories that we have learned, we must make it a point that we practicalize them in communities. Excellent indeed. Another important thing you mentioned in your presentation that I will tease out in my own way, that it is very important, and I like it, because what we are engaged in currently, even in academia, we have academics who are compromising in many things. You compromise even with your values. You compromise even with your feelings. You compromise with everything. You compromise even with the social justice principles that you have to stand upon. And in focusing on that, I heard what you mentioned, Professor Hasim, and that brought me to some of the reflections that you mentioned, drawing from Mama's writings about how Mama wrote about Indians and Africans, that Mama's heart was for different races. She was a humanist. She was never a racist person. She was embracing all races. And what I also liked about her is the fact that, as you were explaining, she was also comfortable about being an Indian. And today, as we are talking about, being a scholar that is active, and also seeing what my brother, Professor Jay, and my sister, Professor Sidat, has done with sociology, and my dean, Professor Ojong, has agreed that this has to happen in the committee. What I will say, as you have mentioned about our legend, about not compromising, not romanticizing, not being biased. This brings me to the fore. You know, I have always discovered that, a lot of our Indian academics, Indian young scholars, the youth, there is a sense of our brothers and sisters feeling that it's as if they don't belong. The lecture for today, at this moment, just for this part, I want to say this lecture is a challenge. This lecture is a revival. This lecture, it is an injection for our Indian community to stand up and arise and start saying Africa belongs also to Indians and not compromise about their Indianship. It is time, as you have mentioned, rightfully so, that the issues of decolonization, they never only arise now. Even Mama Fatima focused on that. So now, as I said, allow me at this moment, when I thank the two of you, when you bring our mother to, alive as an Indian woman who was able to show her love to humanity beyond the issue of race. Allow me, when I talk to our Indian brothers and sisters, to say, through this lecture, it is time to those who are listening, who are Indians, that it is time to also stand up. Do not compromise. For me, I have been fighting. I said at some point to one of my colleagues, I would love to have a project on Indianizing the curriculum. And the colleague said, Dr. Masondo, please don't say that here in South Africa. Your head will be chopped. I'm that kind of a person. I better be killed for standing for the truth. And this is what uncompromising scholarship is all about. This is what we stand for as activist scholars, which I am. And for this lecture, as what you have said, the message has to be put across, and we shouldn't compromise. Time has come for the Indian youth to stand up and say, this is also my country. You have mentioned, Prof, that Indians have a stake in South Africa. That is what Mama said. And in memory of Mama, it's time for every Indian to say, since I have a stake, we worked, you look at the history of Indians, it is time to say, this is what we have done. We have worked together. Let us work together. It is time, as Mama has said, that women, they stood together. They marched to Pretoria as women, different races. Let us unite, because the cry that Mama had, as the profs have indicated, that she wanted Indians and Africans to unite and all races, white and whoever, to unite. So in saying that, on behalf of the committee and UKZN, we just want to say to the two of you, you are marvelous. We just want to say to the two of you, indeed, we were not mistaken to say you are the best to be able to represent our icon at this age, at this dispensation of disorder where we don't know what is what. Also, I just want to say to Umama, Ugcina Umhlophe, an excellent facilitator, anti-apartheid activist, an actress, storyteller, a poet, playwright, Mhlophe, Mvubelo, Mdukase, Mhlanga, Zindela, Nyathela, Unyathela, Mhlopekazi, Ngomkhonto, abanye benyathela, ngenyawo. Siyabonga for an excellent job. Thank you also to the committee for the fact that they were able to organize this, especially Professor Sidat, the dean, by also popping out funds together with Mr. Zulu to make it a point that this lecture is realized. The DVC, thank you very much. The committee said, I must say that. And your office. Also for releasing Usis Melissa Mongru for coming to assist us in organizing the lecture and ensuring that, you know, everything that is related with issues of, you know, public relations are realized. Our masterminds, the technical team, thank you very much. Corporate relations, especially Usis Melissa Mongru, Usajal Desai, thank you very much. And lastly, to you all lovely audience from UKZN, from all over the world, we want to say thank you. We hope from today onwards, we are now married because of this lecture. And next year we will see you. I'm sorry for the long thanks because I was given 2 pages because we had to work together. So thank you very much, everyone. Siyabonga. Siyabonga. Mama Tina, I can bring it back to you because I can see you are back here. Okay.
Thank you so much, Relebucha. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank every single one of the members of the audience who joined us. And I'm sure they learned a lot. What a rich lecture. This is truly a pioneering spirit. Thank you, Siyabonga. I salute. Don't forget to go to the UKZN website, to the YouTube channel. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks everyone for making the time to put together this lecture. And until the next one, hopefully it will be in person come 2023.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Umar, thank you.
Thank you, Luna and Mariam, for organizing this, and Melissa for being so excellent in the admin. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Prof. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. I will be ending the webinar now, and we can communicate if need be at a later stage and for organizing for next year. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.